There we go. So this is Matt, and he is doing the back squat. So in the lowering phase, his hips are in flexion, and his gluteus maximus and hamstrings are moving in eccentric motion. In the lifting phase, his hips are in extension, and his gluteus maximus and hamstrings are working in concentric. In the lowering phase, his knees are in flexion, and his quadriceps are in eccentric. And in the lifting phase, his knees are in extension, and his quadriceps are concentric. So Matt is doing the front squat. In order for him to do the front squat, his hips need to be in flexion, and his hamstrings and gluteus maximus are working in eccentric. In the lowering phase, his knees are in flexion, and his quadriceps are in eccentric. In the lifting phase, his hips are in extension, and his gluteus maximus and hamstrings are in concentric. And in the lifting phase, his knees are in extension, and his quadriceps are in concentric. He makes sure to keep his back straight and that his knees don't go over his toes. So Matt is now doing a split squat. In the lowering phase, his knee joint is in flexion and his quadriceps are moving in eccentric. His hip joint is in flexion and his gluteus maximus and hamstrings are in eccentric. In the lifting phase, his knee joint is in extension and his quadriceps are moving concentric. And his hip joint is in extension and his gluteus maximus and hamstrings are in concentric. He makes sure that when he squats that his knee does not go over his toes, which means his stance is wide enough for him to do the split squat. Here Matt is doing the glute ham raise. In the lifting phase, his knees are in flexion and his hamstrings are in a concentric contraction. In the lowering phase, his knees are in extension and his hamstrings are in an eccentric contraction. He makes sure that when he does this exercise that his back is straight and that his knees fully extend. Okay, go ahead. He's doing a lunge, which is similar to the split squat. The only difference is that his feet are moving, where in a split squat, his feet are cemented to the floor. His knee joint is in flexion and his quadriceps are in eccentric. His hip joint is in flexion and his gluteus maximus and hamstrings are in eccentric on the lowering phase. And his knee joint is in extension and his quadriceps are in concentric. And his hip joint is in extension and his gluteus maximus and hamstrings are in concentric on the lifting phase. Matt is now doing the glute ham raises. In the lifting phase, his knees are in flexion and his hamstrings are moving concentric. In the lowering phase, his knees are in extension and his hamstrings are eccentric. He makes sure that when he does this move that he shoots up and then out and does not bend at the hip. His back stays straight and his head stays aligned with his back. He is now doing a conventional deadlift starting from the floor. In the lifting phase, his knees are in extension and his quadriceps are in a concentric contraction. His hips are in extension and his gluteus maximus and hamstrings are also concentric. In the lowering phase, his knees are in flexion and his quadriceps are eccentric. And his hips are in flexion and his gluteus maximus and hamstrings are eccentric. He makes sure to bend at the knees and the hips and to not hunch over in his back, and that his back and his head are in alignment. Matt is now doing the Romanian deadlift. So in the lifting phase, his knees are in extension and his quadriceps are concentric. His hips are in extension and his gluteus maximus and hamstrings are concentric. In the lowering phase, his knees are in flexion and his quadriceps are eccentric, and his hips are in flexion and his gluteus maximus and hamstrings are eccentric. The Romanian deadlift is very similar to the conventional deadlift, except you start off the rack and your weights do not touch the floor. You make sure to paint your legs with the bar and that you stay straight in the back and the head and that you bend at the knees and the hip. So here Matt is doing the leg press. In the lifting phase, his hips are in extension, his gluteus maximus and hamstrings are in a concentric contraction. His knees are in extension and his quadriceps are in a concentric contraction. In the lowering phase, his hips are in flexion, his gluteus maximus and hamstrings are eccentric, and his knees are in flexion and his quadriceps are in eccentric.
This is Elisha, and she's doing box squats. In the lowering phase, her hips and knees are in flexion, and she's eccentrically activating her glutes, her hamstrings, and her quads. And then the lowering phase, she's extending her hips and her knees also, and also activating her glutes and her quads concentrically. She's just barely touching the box as she goes down. Go ahead. Now Elisha's doing step-ups. She's extending her knee and her hip on the way up. On the way down, she's flexing her hip and her knee. She's activating her glutes and her hamstrings concentrically and eccentrically. Stepping up with her heel. Stepping down with the opposite foot. Good job. Go ahead. Now she's doing Bulgarian split squats. Alicia's doing split squats. The lowering phase, she's flexing her knee and her hip joint. She's activating her quads and glutes eccentrically. In the lowering phase, she's activating her knee and hip joint, extending them concentrically. Her knee is not going past her toes, straight up and down, keeping her back straight. Looking good. Go ahead. Alicia's doing good mornings. Bending at the hips, keeping her back straight, squeezing her shoulder blades together towards her spine. Keeping her head in alignment with her spine. Getting those hamstrings involved. So now Alicia's doing reverse hyperextensions. She's extending and flexing at the hip. Just going smoothly. One smooth motion, it's not choppy. Just keeping a good position, good posture. So now Alicia's doing prone leg curls. Just making sure her hips were right at the bend of the bed. Her heels were right at the pad of the machine. Just lifting her legs straight up and down. Eccentrically and concentrically.